So the early days of General Idea, we were just a group of people having a good time, really. And we went everywhere together, parties, we always showed up together. And we started to become known as a kind of Toronto phenomenon, this group of people, and we clearly needed a name. The first real art exhibition we were invited to be in was it was really the first exhibition that A Space did, one of the earliest artist-run centers. I think it opened in '71 in Toronto. Oh, actually, it was the show, it was before they became A Space. It was the last show in that same building, but before A Space opened. It was a show that was supposedly pulling together the new pool of young talent, showing the new faces in Toronto. We proposed a project for that exhibition, which at that time we called General Idea. And the gallery misunderstood and thought that it was the name of the group. So on the invitation card and so on, we were listed as General Idea everywhere. We thought, okay, well, I guess we're General Idea now. We needed a name. And we liked it because it was kind of corporate and anonymous. And we liked the idea of trying to avoid what we called the myth of the individual genius and be a more collaborative, a more horizontal kind of working group. So that's how General Idea started. And at that time, I mean, and really to a large extent today, Canada is a kind of linear country in terms of the population. Something like 90% of the population live within 100 miles of the US border. And so it's a country 100 miles high and 5,000 miles long. And this means that in order for the country to exist at all, it has to be very conscious of media. And Canada has always had media as its specialty. I remember when I was growing up, if I turned, well, I didn't have a television until the mid-50s, but when you turned on the television, you would get mostly American television because that's what there was. And if you went to a magazine stand, you would see mostly American magazines because that's what there was. So the Canadian government put a lot of emphasis on supporting magazines, television, all forms of media. And I think the Canadian consciousness evolved around an idea of media. And in a way, that's a very conceptual kind of frame of mind. So for example, if we think of Marshall McLuhan, probably the most famous Canadian in terms of media, but also more recently, Canada is the country that develops the telecommunications technology for American satellites and spaceships. So Canada is a country about media, and that's true in the art world as much as it is in any other world. I was born in Vancouver, but by the time I became an adult, when I left school, I was living in Toronto, and there I met Felix and Jorge, and the three of us began sharing a little house with some friends. We didn't actually know we were an art group at the time, we just thought we were entertaining ourselves. And we had a little storefront on a shopping street, and we did exhibitions in our store window that were kind of fake stores. I don't think we knew they were art projects at the time. Again, we just thought we were kind of having fun. But of course, they were totally conceptual because they were made from the debris of the local businesses. We took what we had at hand, and that was what we found in the garbage, bookstores and so on. And we turned those works, we turned that material into works that we exhibited in our store window, which opened into our living room. Toronto at that time was extremely provincial. There was no real sense of being part of a larger art world out in the world. There was no sense of a national community. But around 1970, I think it's 70, the Canada Council developed something it called the Travel Grant. And with the Travel Grant, Canadian artists could get money to travel to another city, I think only within Canada, to do research, to be present at an opening of their work, so on and so forth. And suddenly, Canadian artists across the country were traveling back and forth and getting to know each other. And there was a kind of communication and a discussion and a dialogue started to flow back and forth along the country. And because there was no money for something like shipping paintings or something like that, the work that we were doing was entirely media-based and conceptual, because that was something that That was something that we could send across the country cheaply and easily. And so Canada became known very quickly, in fact, for video art. And by the end of the 70s, I think in 1980, the Canadian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale was entirely Canadian video art.
Beautiful people. Thank you.
General idea is basically this: a framing device within which we inhabit the role of the artist as we see the living legend. We can be expected to do what is expected within these bounds. We are aware of the limitations of this and refer to it as our frame of reference and act accordingly behind the lines. Projecting our roles gives us some perspective to start with, so we can see clear to project our frames frame by frame.
So the artist run, I guess this exhibition, it's about conceptual art in Canada, but it has its roots in the Canadian artist-run centers network, because that's where those artists were operating. I think a lot of the artists, especially in the early 70s in Canada, were very interested in the idea of self-government, as you call it. Like, they weren't so interested in museums or commercial galleries. There weren't any commercial galleries. The museums were pretty bad on the whole, with the exception of the Vancouver Art Gallery, which had really exceptional program. So the artists realized that they had to start their own institutions, they had to start their own galleries and their own media. They started magazines, and a whole kind of parallel world grew in Canada, which is quite unique. I don't know really of anything else like it anywhere. In '72, our very enlightened Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, announced a new program called Local Initiatives. And it was a kind of McLuhan-esque program. The idea was that the government would give money to young people to do projects that would benefit their local community. The money could only be used for salaries, and any other materials had to be donated by local businesses or whatever. And what that really funded was a lot of children's playgrounds all across the country. Suddenly there were children's playgrounds constructed by young people in the community who were unemployed, and they could get materials donated by construction companies or whatever. So suddenly there were playgrounds everywhere. But we came forward with the idea that our community was not a geographical community, it was not local, but rather it was a national community, a community of artists. And we proposed to start an art magazine called File Magazine that would act as a kind of communication tool across the country for artists. So the first issue of File Magazine included Mr. Peanut on the cover, Mr. Peanut from Vancouver. And Mr. Peanut and that whole Vancouver scene, these were a group of people we had come to know because of Canada Council travel grants, really, I suppose. And we came to have a lot of collaboration with Vancouver. I'm not sure why Vancouver, but we did. And that's how we began File. We received money, and then we received some additional money. So I think about the first 5 or 6 issues were funded by Pierre Trudeau. And File was a kind of strange magazine. They were a little nervous about it at first once they saw it. And you'll see it in the exhibition. It still looks a little strange today. We based it on Life magazine because we wanted it to be absolutely familiar, kind of recognizable, that we could put as weird a content into it as we wanted, but somehow it would have this air of familiarity. So it could go on a newsstand and ordinary people would pick it up and look at it, who might never look at an art magazine. And that strategy worked, in fact. We were sued by Time Life for the similarity to Life magazine. They thought we were trying to steal their audience from them. And we settled out of court in the end. We had to change our logo, but the Village Voice ran a series of articles about the situation and kind of made fun of Time Life. And finally Time Life had to just kind of back out of the situation because it was making them look too foolish. I guess also because of the fact that we wanted to demonstrate to the government that we were using the money for this kind of trans-Canada communication between artists, we included these Vancouver artists on the cover of the first issue. And there's also quite a bit of content from Montreal and Halifax and so on in the same issue. You know, in the 70s, even in the 80s and the 90s, magazines were laid out in a very different way than they are now. We had to kind of teach ourselves how to produce a publication. This kind of collage work, and you use wax to stick everything down, and we actually managed to buy our own little typesetting machine, and we used a kind of layout sheet, a standardized layout sheet, printed in pale blue with grids, which was supplied to us by the printer. Now in the mid to late 70s, we found ourselves collecting images, especially images from the post-war period, images of progress, for example, images of the future that we found inspiring for our work. And we needed a way to collect those images. In a way, we thought of putting them on little index cards in a file box, and then we turned that into an art project that we call the show cards. So the show cards are each fairly large. Actually, they're the layout sheet for File magazine is what they are. And on each of those cards, we would place a photograph along with the text describing what the photograph is about, why it's of inspiration to us, and then the data of where we found the image, and so on and so forth. And as that project developed, as we started to collect this image collection, as it were, an image bank, in fact, we also began to include our own images of our own projects to create a more complex system of images. And there's a group of those show cards. There were over 300 in total. A group of those show cards is included here. So a lot of the show cards were images of architecture, images of the future of architecture, because the same way that we started our own archive and bookstore with Art Metropole, we started our own magazine with File, we decided we wanted to begin our own museum as well. And we called that the 1984 Miss General Idea Pavilion. So a lot of the projects that we did through the 70s especially and into the 80s have to do with that, this kind of imaginary architecture, our idea of our ideal museum, which is quite different from what museums actually look like. So for example, in this exhibition you see the Luxon VB print, and this is an image of how all the windows in our museum would be outfitted with a kind of Venetian blind of double-sided mirror that creates a visual collage between the outdoors and the indoors. So the idea of the pavilion was that every installation that we did for a museum show or a gallery show would be a room from the pavilion. And our idea was that if we could sell those rooms to museums, then these rooms from the pavilion would be kind of parasites in existing museums, and our museum would be this kind of decentralized museum that existed in other museums around the world. And for example, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven purchased a piece quite early, and we were so thrilled because that was the beginning of this kind of occupying of other museums. So we never expected to build a building the way other people thought of it in concrete terms, but rather it was more this decentralized architecture.
A lot of people have asked us if we actually intend to construct the 1984 Miss General Idea Pavilion, and the architect in us always answers yes. The pavilion will definitely occupy as much space on real estate as it does in the media now.
Montreal was a very important part of the Canadian centre for all of us in the 60s and 70s especially. But there's that moment in the history of Quebec where the English all leave. So in the 70s there's a very important centre called avec in Montreal that we were quite involved with, and we knew all the people there and so on. And it was a place where a lot of people who went on to do other things started. So Parachute magazine began out of Véhicule. René Blouin went on to the Canada Council from Véhicule and then opened his own gallery in Montreal, a commercial gallery. So Véhicule was a place where a lot of the Québécois art scene emerged from that one place, English and French together. And that was very interesting that it was English and French together, equally involved in this one place. It was quite conceptual, so people like Bill Vazan and Tom Dean, for example. That group of people gave us a lot of material for File magazine. We were included in shows there, so there was this kind of Montreal and Toronto are odd cities in there. The cities that love to hate each other. You know, it's a little bit like Los Angeles and New York. And at the same time, there's always this constant flow between the two. So it was that was an interesting time. But Véhicule eventually closed, and then it seemed like the French art scene withdrew and created more its own territory, separate from the English scene. Maybe Parachute was the only thing left that tried to keep more contact with both worlds. I've always felt it was a shame that we lost that interconnection, because it's never really come back the way that it was.
My name is Jorge Zontel, and with me I have AA Bronson and Felix Parts. We call ourselves General Idea. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to tell you about the art of General Idea.
We do beauty pageants.
And File magazine.
And TV specials.
We've been working together since 1968.
And we're working together till 1984.
So the video Pilot was modeled after a television show, and it was actually produced for the Educational Channel in Toronto, in Ontario. And then that begins, in a way, our focus on consumerism, which then went on until 1980, really, that period from the 77 to 1980. There's 3 years where the work really talks about consumerism. And that's the period in which we made, for example, the boutique from the Miss General Idea Pavilion, which we'd had our first museum show, our first solo museum show at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in '79. And we thought to ourselves, you know, why there's the Stedelijk's gallery shop and they're not selling our stuff. We should have our own gallery shop so that every time we have a show in a museum, we can kind of occupy the museum with our shop and sell our merchandise. So in a way it was a kind of ironic, it was kind of a joke, and it was a kind of cultural critique of consumerism and the art world and Western culture. And at the same time, we were kind of serious about it. We really did want to sell our multiples and editions and little publications and so on. For the first 17 years of that time, we worked out of Toronto, our loft in Toronto. And people would always say, well, how can you work together as a group? First of all, can you really be an artist and be a group? And we said we could. We were interested in expanding the idea of the artist into a group form. And then people said, well, how can you not fight? I mean, why don't you, I mean, how can you last so long? And our technique was very easy, actually. We just always said, well, we're committed to working together until 1984. We had this kind of ultimate project we wanted to do in 1984. And every time we had a big fight, we would say, okay, well, it's only 6 more years, and then, you know, it's only 3 more years, it's only 1 more year. And by the time we got to 1984, it was like a bad habit. We'd worked together for so long, we didn't know how not to work with each other. In '86, we decided to move to New York because we felt we'd kind of used up Canada. It's funny, we had a big career in Europe in the late 70s and early 80s, but we didn't actually show in the US until '86. We had our first show at the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, and then we moved to New York and had a gallery representing us there called International with Monument, who also represented Jeff Koons and people like that. It was a very smart little up-and-coming gallery. Felix kind of freaked out at this moment and decided he didn't like New York and wanted to move back to Toronto, so off he went the night before our big opening. And from then on, we worked more or less by fax machine. So for 7 years, Jorge and I would be in New York and Felix would be in Toronto, and we'd travel back and forth, but still we were in 2 different cities. And the fax machine would be continuously rolling, paper coming out of the fax machine with ideas going back and forth. So we developed a kind of unique way of working together. In '89, Felix was diagnosed with AIDS. In 1990, Jorge was diagnosed with AIDS. And then by '93, Jorge and I moved back to Toronto, primarily in a way, well, first of all, we needed to consolidate our efforts. We needed to think about what work we still wanted to produce while we still had time to produce it, and it was easier to be with each other. And secondly, the Canadian medical system was so much better than the American system, especially in relation to HIV and AIDS. Now, part of the Canadian situation was that if you signed a paper saying that you wanted to die at home, and if you were considered to have a terminal illness, which at that time AIDS was a terminal illness, then you could stay at home, not go into hospital, and the doctors and nurses would come to you. So Felix and Jorge did that, and we found an enormous apartment. It was luckily at the moment where the market collapsed, so there was suddenly the value of real estate went way down around the early 90s, and we were able to rent this enormous apartment that was big enough for wheelchairs or hospital beds or nurses and doctors, whatever we needed. And there we continued to work very intensely for the last year of their life. And Jorge died there in February of '94, and Felix 5 months later. The work of General Idea breaks into several periods, but in a way the foundation of General Ideas is the work we do up until about 1984. And it's a work which, it's about creating our own parallel universe to the real world and the real art world. So we started our own gallery shop called Art Metropole, and it also had an archive, and it was also an exhibition space. We started our own magazine file. We were working on our own museum called the 1984 Miss General Idea Pavilion. And so all of our projects, every installation, every painting, whatever we did, every videotape, somehow was part of this bigger construction of creating this parallel universe. '84 was our ultimate year, we thought, was when everything was going to come together, the pavilion would be built, and so on and so forth. And instead, we just somehow continued working. So at that point, everything became a little confusing for us because our kind of destination year didn't make any sense anymore. And we floundered a bit. We weren't sure what we were doing for a couple of years, '85, '86. And then when we moved to New York, we also discovered that this very complex scenario of the pavilion and the pageant and this parallel universe, Americans don't have enough patience to listen to all of that. You know, their attention span was much too short. The works in the early '80s are really about sexuality. There's a lot of underlying text about the three of us being gay. So we used the poodle a lot. And at that time, art critics didn't talk about gender or sexuality. Those subjects were never discussed. They were considered to be outside of the art world. Art was more abstract than that. And we kept trying to push the critics to address sexuality. So the poodles, you know, there's these paintings of poodles that seem to be having sex with each other. And the critics would say, oh, well, it's a metaphor for collective working together, you know. And they just refused to talk about sexuality. It was 1986 before a critic actually wrote about us in terms of sexuality, and that was in a small British journal. And the person who did the writing had come out of a new program in Britain on queer theory. And it was just when queer theory first started in the literary realm. He really came from a literary background. And then once queer theory came out into the world, then suddenly it was possible. It was okay to write about sexuality. And also, at the same time, a friend of ours who worked at the Canadian consulate in New York became sick with AIDS and ended up in a hospital which was immediately next door to our apartment. So we spent a lot of time looking after this friend. And suddenly we started to produce work that was about AIDS. And then for the next 7 years, really, we only produced work about AIDS. And we took all the strategies that we had developed over the previous 17, 18, 19 years, we took all those strategies now and applied them to a real kind of problem, like how do you give visibility to a disease which, especially in the US, nobody was talking about and nobody was dealing with. So in a way, we became like a kind of advertising agency. We were an advertising agency developing very complex kinds of programs around the subject of AIDS.
And it isn't art unless the audience responds.
And to make sure the audience responds, we rehearsed them in the correct response for 1984. So to provide the necessary climax to this 30 minutes, we want all of you to play your part in this scenario with a standing ovation.
Okay, all ready?
I'm ready.
Go!
Let's go. Okay, are you all ready? This is very important. It's really your starring role. This is your starring role. Okay? All ready? Excellent, excellent, very good, very good. Best ever. Beautiful city, beautiful people. Thank you.